We will go ahead and get started. Thank you all so much for your flexibility with our time today. As long as we started at 10, I was going to feel good, and wherever the wind blew us at that point is what it is. We're very, very thankful that y'all are back. Thankful for the Thomasons allowing us to come spend some time at their home. But we do want to turn our attention back over to Saif as he presents his final session for today on evangelizing Muslims. Again, if you have any questions that you would like to submit for the question and response hour, please get those to me, and we'll work through those. After you get some of the session, we'll take some time working through those and then conclude our time together here in these studies today. Does anybody need any index cards for questions? Anybody need any? Yes, ma'am. Anybody else? Okay. All right. I'll hand those out, and then Saif, it'll be your turn, sir.
Hello again, good to see you. Appreciate the time we've spent together so far. It's been good. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I hope you've learned some things and taken some things away that you've found useful, and I hope edifying as well. I hope your faith has been built up as well. This session we're going to be looking at evangelizing Muslims. How is it that as Christians we might be effective in teaching people the gospel? We understand that we're charged with that. We understand the Great Commission. We understand that we need to go and we need to teach people about the gospel. How is it that we're going to go about that with people coming from the faith of Islam? There's a lot of really good questions to consider about doing that, and we'll spend some time talking about that. I want to set the stage a little bit. I want to give a proper setting and a proper context, a full context really, of everything that we're going to look at here. And I'll start by saying, there are views that we can have that if we understand what our goal is, if we understand we're supposed to evangelize all people, of course that would be Muslims included. There are views that we can have that can really hinder us from doing that. Sometimes we look at evangelism and we say, well, we like to think about things we can't do, and why we can't do them. I can't evangelize because, for example, some of the trademark ones are, I'm too scared to talk to people. I don't know enough. What if somebody asks me a question, I don't know the answer, things like that. But there are other views that we can have that actually make our task way more difficult. There have been many claims by people in the world that have professed to be Christians that are frankly abusive to Muslims, and I think social media has driven that fear and that hatred to a whole new level, because now with social media you can pretty much, you can tweet it, right? How long does it take to write a tweet? Not long. How many people does it go out to? Billions if they're willing to look for it. Right? That is a recipe for a lot of things. And one of them could be disaster. And of course we've seen that amongst politicians as well. We've seen politicians from all types, all types of politicians and all type of leaders in the world that have taken to social media to voice their opinion. And one of the problems with social media that we see is that it's sound bites, and I'm afraid that that's how we get a lot of our media that way. We get a lot of our media, really important things, and we get them in sound bites. And that's not really a good way to really drill down and study anything, I think, for that matter. Unfortunately, I have to say, the denominational world and those that profess to be Christians are not the only people that have said things that are frankly and held views that are frankly un-Christ-like views and attitudes. And mainstream fear and hatred has in some cases found its way into the hearts of brethren, right? So, I mentioned earlier, and I won't go into this part in detail until tomorrow, but I mentioned earlier that I've seen some things on social media from people that are brethren, people that I know the truth, have obeyed the gospel, that I've been to church with previously that have said some things that are very unbecoming of Christians. Now, I understand that these thoughts and these fears that people have, they don't, our fears don't usually arrive without some type of fuel, right? So, usually, not always. Can you be afraid of the dark just because you don't know what's there? Yeah, the fear of the unknown. It doesn't mean that you've maybe had a bad experience in the dark. You might just be afraid of the unknown. But there have been many terrible things that have been said and done in the name of Islam. There are lots of things that are terrible that have happened, and people have attached that name tag to it of Islam, or to be a Muslim. And those things that happen, they make us pause, right? They make us pause and think, well, do I really want to evangelize, when I might have something to worry about? And again, we'll go further into that, I think, more certainly tomorrow morning. And I will try, by the way, and allow that lecture in the Bible class period to be a little bit shorter so that we can have 10 to 15 minutes of questions at the end of the Bible class period. So I'll do my best to make that happen, and we should be able to do that. But I think the point that I'm trying to make right now is that we're torn, right? We're torn. Sometimes we can be torn, feeling, okay, I understand the need to evangelize, and I can also be torn thinking like, hey, I've seen all these things on the news, like, what am I supposed to do? How am I supposed to feel, and how am I supposed to figure this out? So maybe one way to look at this at the beginning is to answer the question, how should Christians view Muslims? If we're going to evangelize Muslims, then how is it that a Christian should view a Muslim? We, of course, must not only consider the Bible as our guide to answering that question, but we consider the Bible as our authority to answering that question. Sometimes we use the Bible too much, I think, as like a roadmap, right? Like it's not, a roadmap's useful, okay? The Bible's more than useful. It's authoritative. So it's a little bit different. I've been asked this question in a Q&A a while back. And if you want to turn to John chapter 4, you can. But the question was, Saif, how do you think Jesus would view a Muslim? How do you think Jesus would view a Muslim? And the part that I really like about questions, and questions like that as well, is that I have an authority, right? Like I have an authority that I can go to, and I can say, well, are there any examples in the New Testament that might help me answer this question of how Jesus might view a Muslim? And I think John chapter 4 gives us a good picture. So let's look at John chapter 4. Let's read this passage really quick. Let's make some quick application, and then let's get into the rest of the lesson as it's supposed to be. So in John chapter 4 and verse 7, we have the Samaritan woman and Jesus at the well with her. So in John chapter 4, verse 7, a woman from Samaria came to draw water. Jesus said to her, "Give me a drink." For his disciples had gone away into the city to buy food. The Samaritan woman said to him, "How is it that you, a Jew, ask for a drink from me, a woman of Samaria? For Jews have no dealings with Samaritans." Jesus answered her, "If you knew the gift of God and who it was that is saying to you, 'Give me a drink,' you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water." The woman said to him, "Sir, you have nothing to draw water with, and the well is deep. Where do you get that living water? Are you greater than our father Jacob? He gave us the well and drank from it himself, as did his sons and his livestock." Jesus said to her, "Everyone who drinks of this water will be thirsty again, but whoever drinks of the water that I will give him will never be thirsty again. The water that I will give him will become in him a spring of water welling up to eternal life." The woman said to him, "Sir, give me this water so that I will not be thirsty or have to come here to draw water." So it's a really interesting exchange here between the Samaritan woman and Jesus. And what makes it really interesting, I think, is verse 9. At the end of verse 9, first of all, she asked the question. She's very confused that Jesus has asked her to help him with water. And the confusion is kind of cleared up at the end of verse 9 where it says, "For Jews have no dealings with Samaritans." Jews had no dealings with Samaritans in this time, and that's not too different from what we see today. And I can certainly tell you, once you have firsthand experience with certain things, things get impressed upon you in a way that's difficult to forget, right? So if you think back to 9/11, for example, And 9/11/2001, I was a Muslim at the time. I was 16 years old, and I got in 3 fights in school that week. And before 9/11/2001, nobody knew I was a Muslim. I don't remember that ever coming up in any conversation with any of my friends or anybody at school or anything. I remember what proceeded from that was, I remember there were plenty of places, I lived in Florida at the time, and there were plenty of places that wouldn't hire Muslims. They wouldn't serve Muslims, food places, grocery stores. This is in America, okay? You know, we like to look at other parts of the world and say, man, how barbaric they are and how ridiculous they are. I was in Florida. You know, I was in Florida. And this was the reality. You could almost say at that time, and certainly perhaps it could be continued even to this day, it almost would be like Christians have no dealings with Muslims. I'm reading no dealing with Samaritans and Jews, and it's like, yeah, the principle is laid there by Jesus. And I think that's what's so interesting and amazing about this example, is that if you take the principle that Jesus used, and then you filter that principle through, how would Jesus treat a Muslim? Well, he'd offer them the living water so that they would never have to come back to the well, so they'd never thirst again. And anybody that I've said that to, if anybody's ever contended with that in a difficult way in their heart, you know, like, Jesus is the example. If this was my book, right? Like if I was the author of this book and this was my opinion about how we should be treating Muslims, that would be different. You can argue with me about that all you want. That's why I don't write books, because I don't want to get into the debate, right? I don't want to do that. The best book or series of books has already been written. So we have to follow this. And I hope at this point, and as we've laid the stage of this lesson, I hope at this point you're saying, okay, you know what, I get it. I want to study with Muslims. And the first question you might ask is, you know, where might you find a Muslim? And of course, as we looked at this morning, and we looked at the population, and we see population trends, you're going to be finding Muslims pretty regularly. I don't know if there's a mosque in the area. I don't know where the nearest mosque is to Loudoun. That's something that probably could be looked up and probably should be looked up if you're living in the area, right? But there's one in Dalton. There's a pretty big one in Dalton as well. And, you know, it's kind of interesting because it's Northwest Georgia. I wouldn't have expected that moving up here. But that's how many Muslims there are, just in general. They're just around. So of course we understand that, you know, maybe Muslims they're actually everywhere. Instead of wondering where they are, we're more interested in how we might gain a Bible study with a Muslim, because it is likely that you will probably encounter some Muslims from time to time. How do we get a Bible study with a Muslim? I'll first say this, and then I'll get into the rest of the lesson. And this could be, you know, unpopular opinion or not. I'm not sure. I didn't grow up in the church, so I don't know which parts are the unpopular opinion. I've learned some over the last 14 years. This could be unpopular opinion or not, but this is my opinion. I don't think a Bible study, folks, is only described as, you know, it's me in a chair right here, there's a table, and then there's you in a chair right here, and I've got my Bible out, and you've got your Bible out, and now we've got a study. I think when I'm sitting with a young man last week who's contemplating his life, and we're sitting in his backyard on a couple lawn chairs, and we're talking about the Bible, and we're talking about his spiritual life, and we're making application to the apostles, etc., what I referenced earlier, I think that's a Bible study. I'm helping him understand and use the power of the text to empower his life, right? We're studying the Bible. And more importantly, I think we're making application of the Bible study. How about Bible application? Okay, that's rant over. What should you be looking for? Look for what I call people of peace. I think that's a term that you should strongly consider and then we can talk about what that means. You could say person of peace or people of peace. I think either one works, and I'll make the point to you. The point is that there are people, and in this case Muslims, who are attempting to live their life in a way that would please Allah, or in other words, please God. Okay? There are people that are trying to live peacefully by what their religion teaches them. And that could mean many things. That could mean a Muslim that you work with or that you go to school with that you know prays. Because they got to pray 5 times a day, right? So if you're at work, and let's say you got a Muslim person that works in another department, or in your department or another department or whatever, and at the same time every day, they're never at their desk. Now they're either on lunch, and they're very disciplined when they take their lunch break, or they're praying. Right? So we will see people like this. What about Muslims that we know observe religious holidays? Do you know anybody that observed and fasted for Ramadan? You know, is there someone you're connected to on Facebook that posted about Ramadan, or maybe they didn't post that they were fasting, but maybe you saw like a picture of a really nice spread of food. And you're like, man, that is a large table of food. What is going on? And it's like, you know, in the post it says, you know, very excited to, you know, after a nice day of fasting, to be able to sit down and eat, you know, with my family or whatever. And maybe they observe religious holidays, right? They observe religious traditions. These are people that you might know. In Acts chapter 2, at the day of Pentecost, we often go to Acts chapter 2, and we should, right? We should. In Acts chapter 2, what we find in Acts chapter 2 is what I would consider a gathering of the term that we just used, people of peace, persons of peace. In Acts chapter 2 and verse 1, when the day of Pentecost arrived, they were all together in one place. What were they there doing? Observing a religious holiday. We're not going to preach through Acts chapter 2, but I think you're going to understand the point. What happens in Acts chapter 2? We read a little bit earlier, right, of what Peter's sermon. Let the house of Israel know, therefore, that he is made in both Lord and Christ, this Jesus whom you've crucified, in verse 36. And what is the response? They were cut to the heart, and they asked, what shall we do? Here's what's so interesting about that. Acts chapter 2, bunch of people of peace, not Christians. They're not Christians in verse 1, are they? Right? We don't believe that. We believe that they become Christians when they recognize they've repented, right? They end up getting baptized, and then the Lord adds them to the church at the end of the chapter. So not Christians in verse 1. They are people of peace, though. They are people that are there to observe a religious holiday. They are people of peace. Let's do some math. And I don't like math, but it's really simple math, right? So bear with me. People of peace, 1, met with the gospel, 1 plus 1. They're being added to the Lord's church at the end of this chapter. People of peace are met with the gospel in the same context, and what do? Some respond. In this case, about 3,000. And I'm sure there were a ton that didn't respond. Right? Well, Saif, not everybody responded. Yeah. I assure you, if I was screaming as cars were driving by, the next 10 cars that drove by, and I said, hey, pull over for $100. You think all 10 cars would pull over? They'd probably be like, what a lunatic. He ain't got no $100. He's probably trying to carjack me. One plus 1 equals saved. People of peace met with the gospel, they responded. Acts chapter 8, the Ethiopian eunuch. Remember the Ethiopian eunuch? Is the Ethiopian eunuch a Jew? Is he a Christian? He's an Ethiopian eunuch. That's why they call him the Ethiopian eunuch. You know what I would consider him? How about a person of peace? He's come to Jerusalem to worship, if you want. It's in Acts chapter 8 and verse 28-29. He's come to Jerusalem to worship. And what is he reading from the book of Isaiah? He is somebody who's trying to observe a religious holiday. He's trying to read from the book of Isaiah. He is a person of peace. What ends up happening to the Ethiopian eunuch? Person of peace, met with the gospel, obeys the gospel. Now listen, if Acts chapter 2, I get it. Anything can happen, right? Say, a couple of cars are going to pull over and take the $100. I get it. If Acts chapter 2 and Acts chapter 8 were the only examples we had of this formula where the people of peace are met with the gospel and then they respond, I would be with you. And I'd be like, it's a one-off, in this case a two-off. It's happened twice. The problem is it happens throughout Acts a bunch, right? Acts chapter 10 is your next one. Cornelius. Good old Cornelius. Cornelius was a Christian, right? No, okay. He was a devout Jew, though, right? No, oh no, right. But he was a person of peace. Cornelius in Acts chapter 10, verses 1 and 2, he's described as a devout man who feared God, him and his household. Yeah, hey, fair enough. What else did he do? He gave alms, many alms, and prayed continually. He's met with the gospel. 1 + 1 = 2. There's a response. Acts 17 and verses 16 and 17, when Paul went to Athens. When Paul went to Athens and preached, some believed. These were not Jews. These weren't even people that believed in one God. They had the inscription to an unknown God. And what they were worshiping in ignorance, he was going to make known to them what they were worshiping in ignorance. But the point is that they still knew to worship something. They understood that things were bigger than just them, right? There's a big bridge to gap. But these people were met with the gospel, and some believed. The description of the people in verse 17, the Jews and God-fearing Gentiles, then some philosophers in verse 18, and then those who worshipped an unknown God in verse 23. I think we can consider them people of peace. And when they were met with the gospel, there were some that responded. And these are just some examples. So these people of God or people of peace or persons of peace, whichever variation or iteration of that you want to write down, whichever one seems the best for you. I can tell you, as a former Muslim and as currently with all of my family still Muslims, my parents and my family, my aunts and my grandma that came to this country, the ones that did come to this country, they came looking for the same things that, some of you either came here looking for, or your parents or your grandparents came here looking for, right? They're looking for opportunity. They're looking for a place to live. They're looking for a place to make life. You ever hear this phrase from your parents? I want you to have it better than we did. Isn't that amazing that that's not just an American ideal? I heard that from some Arabic people who were my parents. We just want you to have it better than us. And America is the place that gives us that opportunity. I mean, yeah, it's common sense. It makes sense to me. I'm like, fair enough. I wanted to have it better than y'all too. The vast majority of these people are people that are looking for opportunity. They're looking for a better quality of life. They're looking for a better quality education. They're looking for the things that we have in America. Right now, we could get into a discussion about whether they actually are better quality and this and this and that. But one thing that is, we're not going to do that, but one thing that we can say undoubtedly is that there is so much opportunity here, it's hard to fathom. There really is. Anyone here, sitting here, can start a business today. You could start a business today if you wanted to. What's stopping you? We're the ones who decide, right? That's the beauty of it. And these people are coming here ultimately looking to serve God in some way, shape, or form. And yeah, do they need some help to straighten out the path? Sure. Who doesn't? You know who needs help to straighten out their path? Me. Every day. By the strength with which God supplies. And if I don't have that, I'm in trouble. I'm not that cool. I'm not that great. I need him. I need God. Well, how does that make me any different than anybody else that's coming here? So that being said, considering they're around us, our jobs, our communities, what do we have to do next when we find these people of peace? I found a person of peace. I know somebody who prays. I know someone who observes Ramadan. I know someone who observes religious holidays. I know someone who has a family and they seem very focused on their family and faith and et cetera, et cetera. How do I set up a study? How do I set up a study? The best thing that I can tell you is to build a relationship. You have to build a relationship with people. I don't know if it's just the times. I don't know if it's like a modern thing. I don't know if things have just changed. And I understand, okay, from my reading of history and from talking from people, that there was a time, and maybe it'll come back, okay, but there was a time that you could throw up a tent, you could put revival on the side of the road, and you could put a time in a day, Tuesday night at 7 p.m. or whatever, and you know what? People would show up. If only it was so easy. But listen, I'm not going to get into the parable of the sower, but I think some of the reason why the good seed is the good seed is because we can actually engage in a relationship and we know these people and we understand that we can be there for them. I can tell you right now, if I would have obeyed the gospel, but I didn't have Sarah or Josiah to help me stay on track and help me learn new things and to help keep me accountable, if I didn't have Sarah, I don't know if I would be here. I don't know if I would have made it through those early years. So now is a different story, but the first couple years that I was a Christian, it was hard. It was different. And I didn't know what I know now. So we need to build a relationship with these people. We need to. And the other reason why we need to build a relationship with these people is because Western society, as we alluded to earlier in our Q&A, just like we can have a misinformed view of what's happening in the Middle East and with Muslims, even our country, they can also have a misinformed view of us. They can be looking at Hollywood and say, "You guys are Christians? Are you crazy?" And I'm like, "No, that's not that's not what it is." Right? But if it's me tweeting that back and forth, that's not going to work. I need to know people, and then when I know them and they understand that I'm not going to judge them and that I love them and that I care about them, it happens with people that aren't Muslims all the time at school. I'll get players come to my office, "Coach, can I talk to you?" I'm like, "Yeah, what's up? Can I ask you a question about Christianity? Can I ask you a question about the Bible? My parents are Catholic. They want me to be Catholic. This and this and that." Da, da, da. And it's like, thank God. Thank God that I have not said something so ignorant that they feel like they can't come and talk to me. Because now I got a chance, right? Now I've got a chance. So they can have a misinformed view as well. We need to establish a relationship so that we can also address that misinformed view. We don't want people walking away thinking that what they see on the TV and what they hear on the radio is Christianity. We want them to know the truth. We want them to know the truth. As it relates to practically, how do we go about this practically? Saif, again, you've given some practicality to these people of peace, but how do I establish the relationship? How do I become a friend with this person of peace? Listen, if you're a person of peace, one thing that should be pretty common conversation is your faith. Your faith and your family. Almost anybody that I know that is a devout person, to whatever, faith and family, that's very common discussion. Oh, those, they got a picture on their desk. Those your wife and kids? Yeah, that's them. Cool, that's awesome. Yeah. So, what do you guys like to do? We're going to Dollywood. Have you guys ever been to Dollywood? No, we don't. We've not been to Dollywood. Yeah. Well, we're gonna go. I think it's cool. I'll let you know. I'll let you know if it's cool. But we're gonna go after church, and we go to church up in Highway 27 in Lafayette. Do you guys go to church anywhere? Are you guys religious? Do you mind if I ask? No, I don't mind if you ask. Yeah, we actually go to the mosque. Oh, do you go to the one in, that really nice one, the new looking one in Dalton? That's beautiful. Yeah, we go to that one. Man, that place looks really nice. Like I'm some kind of like magician. It's just a conversation. It's the same conversation that you might have with the person that goes to the Baptist church at 1 p.m. on a Sunday that you recognize in the suit. Remember that example? It's the same conversation. It's just with somebody else who looks a little bit different, which is a good thing. That's a good thing. So the topic of religion or faith or family, that should not be a difficult one to approach for anybody. Listen, I didn't show you a picture of my kids yet, but I'm dying to show you pictures of my kids and my family. I'm excited about that. I'm excited about my family and my faith. I'm not hiding from it. I'm excited about it. So if somebody that is a person of peace, a faithful Christian or a faithful Muslim, the topic of religion or family, that should come up all the time. That should come up all the time. So now you've set yourself apart a little bit. You've got a little bit of a relationship. Maybe you've established a rapport. How is it that you actually, and that's a practical way to do it, and I gave an example and hopefully that was useful. How do you start engaging into theological discussions? All right, because that can be touchy. That can be difficult. It really depends on how you go about it. I think the reason why sometimes politics and sometimes religion can be so touchy is because we're dying oftentimes to talk about the reasons we're different. So for example, I don't like using, political examples, but I'll give you an example. Someone might say, I hear it all the time, especially from my players, Coach, you own a gun? Yeah, I own a few. Really? I'm like, yeah. Now, so that's one way to start a conversation. That's not the best way. Okay, if you want to talk about why people do what they do or whatever. But let me tell you what I don't do in response. You don't own a gun? Are you dumb? What if somebody walks into the dorm and just lights it up, man? Have you not watched all the school shootings? So in other words, because it's like, well, why wouldn't you say that, Saif? That's very common sense and that's very logical. Let me give you an example. So everybody's holding a tomato right now or an egg, right? So you throw an egg at me. You own a gun? You don't? Well, yeah, if you're that scared about school shootings, well, yeah, I'm scared about them. I got kids. We're just slinging mud at each other. We've been in the conversation for 20 seconds. And you've hit me with 3 eggs and I've hit you with 3. What are we doing? What are we doing? Start with the similarities. Don't start with the differences. I know that it gets exciting. Nick and I were talking about this yesterday, that there can be a temptation to make the point, right? You've got this really good point that, by the way, nobody's ever heard before, You are the special one. The force is with you, and you have a very unique point that nobody has ever heard, nobody has ever tackled. It's kind of like the Euthyphro dilemma. I'm not going to go into that, but I love that. An atheist's like, well, what about the Euthyphro dilemma? I'm like, boy, good thing that's been studied for, I don't know, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. I know we want to talk about the things that we think sometimes make us clever, or sometimes we're actually very genuine about it, and we're like, well, we just need to get to the differences so we can help them. Because, the world could end tonight. The world could end tonight. It could, right? I'm not saying that it couldn't. I have no idea. I'm just interested in, what's the best way to be effective? I can't tell you if the world's going to end tonight or not. I don't know. So then I can't always operate on that assumption of it's going to end tonight, so that's got to drive my decision. That can't always work in everything. Start with the similarities. A conversation should be easy if you talk about the similarities in the faith. Why? How many did we observe earlier? A lot. We observed a lot. There are tons of similarities you can talk about. Tons. There's a lot of common ground. How about the fact that the Bible clearly calls for holiness, righteousness, and prayer? The Bible also stresses the importance of family, so much so that the one who doesn't take care of his family, right, is worse than a non-believer. Yeah, that is some statement, that is. That's a statement. You know who might identify with that? Muslims. Okay, I totally understand. This is exactly how the conversation used to go with Sarah or with Josiah. It was like, yeah, we believe that this, and this. And I'm like, us too. Pretty strongly. Really? Yeah, man. There's no skirting around that stuff. Got to take care of your family. Got to take care of your family. These are commonalities that we should focus on. Will that lead to a discussion ultimately about the differences? Yes. Yeah, of course. But allow that to happen once you've already established a relationship, right? So instead of you throwing an egg and I'm throwing an egg, I'm actually sharing valuable information with you and you're sharing valuable information with me. Not because you want to throw an egg at me, but because you would like to cook an egg with me and feed me. There's a difference, right? There's a difference. So once you've established the similarities, you'll see trust growing, you'll see respect growing, and you'll remove all these barriers that separate us. We've got to build these relationships. We've got to be the right people. And from that point on, after we talk about the similarities, we can get to the point about the differences whenever it seems appropriate. When I was a Muslim, once I knew that I was in an environment where I wasn't going to be judged, I was willing to talk. I was willing to be open. I was completely willing to be open with Sarah and Josiah about the hard things, about the differences. And some of it was like, Saif, tell us what you don't like about Christianity. And I was like, Christians. And you know what they said? Because they were also in a non-judgmental zone. Said, sometimes me too. And I was like, wow, fair enough. And it's amazing when you remove these barriers, like the things that you can accomplish. You can just talk. You can just talk. And then, who knows what happens there. So it could be crazy. You don't know what's going to happen. You know what could happen? That would be like unimaginable. The Muslim converts to Christianity, and then he becomes a preacher. I know, it's crazy. It's nuts, right? I know. It is kind of crazy. Yeah, but we could also use, that's the power of the gospel. And to that I would say amen. Okay, I've got a bit of a study going. If you're having this conversation about the commonalities, you're talking about faith, you're talking about family, you're talking about some of these things, you got a little study going, right? It's cool. Where do I start in the scriptures? That's a great question. Because again, everybody thinks you got to pull out the Bible right from the beginning, blah, blah. Talk about the things that are in common. You don't need to sit down across from a table in a dimly lit room and have your Bible out and stuff to start a study. But at the point that you've established the trust, you've established the respect, I think it's another common sense, practical question to ask. Like, where do I start in the scriptures? That's a really good question, okay? And remember, this is my opinion. So this is where I tell you, this is my opinion. I don't know. I don't always know. It depends on the situation. It depends on the situation. But what I'll tell you is that if you consider the Ethiopian eunuch, and you consider that example, he was reading from Isaiah, right? And what was said after that, after he needed some help understanding? Started with Isaiah and preached Jesus. In my mind, it's like, started with the Old Testament and then preached Jesus. I think the reason why the Old Testament, and I find that so interesting, is because the Old Testament, Muslims believe, I said the Injil earlier, which is the Gospels. They believe in the Gospels, right? And if you got a clarifying question about that, we can talk about it here shortly. Like, because what do they believe about it or whatever? They also believe in the Pentateuch. They believe in the first 5 books of the Bible. The story of Moses, they know the story of Moses. The story of Noah, we say. We know the story of Noah. We know Adam and Eve. Hey, yep. We're all on the same page here. Good. For me, I think that's a great place to start, because not only are they familiar with those stories, or should be, right? They should be. But again, I mentioned it earlier, I believe when the Old Testament is properly understood, that can take your faith to a different place. Because you realize how these things work in this melody of this harmony between the Old Testament and the New Testament. So where would I start? I would recommend you start with Adam and Eve in Genesis 3. I would recommend you start right in the beginning. Muslims will be familiar with the story, and even if they were like, hey, I don't know everything about Adam and Eve, I would still start there. I believe that story can be the beginning of what can be a series of very interesting points made through the Old Testament. So in the story, we know the story, right? Adam and Eve, they're in the garden. We don't know how long they've been in the garden. Okay, we're not told, hey, they were in the garden for 92 days and then they made a mistake. We don't know how long they were in the garden, but they were in the garden, and for however long they were in the garden, things seemed to be going pretty well. Until they ate of the tree, right? After that, and again, I'm just kind of moving through the gears on the story because I think we're all on the same page here. After that, they realize they're naked. They sew a couple fig leaves together to cover their nakedness. God's walking through the cool of the garden. Where are you? We were hiding. Why? Because we're naked. Who told you were naked? The thing that's interesting about that, and this is a lesson, and you could take this and make a point about modesty, but, what did God end up doing later in the chapter for them? He ended up making an animal sacrifice and clothing them with a tunic. Why? You look at all the pictures of Adam and Eve, they're covered up, right? You got little fig leaves there, they're good. Here's what, like I said, you could make a lesson about modesty there, but here's the point that I'm making about Islam. If Islam is a deed system, it seems like Adam and Eve, and as they tried in Genesis, will have covered their nakedness. They will have covered their sin with these fig leaves, right? But God says, no, you have not. I need to clothe you because you're naked. So he makes an animal sacrifice. This is the first animal sacrifice. You know what happens the rest of the Old Testament? Animal sacrifice. All the way up to the perfect sacrifice. See how consistent God is? From the very first, it's not like animal sacrifice, like halfway through the Torah, they were like, yo, this sin stuff's getting out of hand. We need to do something. Well, let's sacrifice animals. Great idea. And that'll roll our sins over to the cross, which they don't even know about. That's not how it went, right? From the very first sin, God made a provision for their sin. And whose provision was it? Adam and Eve made a provision. It wasn't good enough to cover their sin. God's provision was needed to cover their sin in the garden. I think we're all on the same page with that, right? If only there were more stories where man's provision fell short and they needed God's provision. That's so cool that there are. And God's infinite wisdom. How about the story of Noah? Let's not even go far. Genesis 6. Told you they'll know in Islam they'll know the story of Noah. I think these are great points, by the way, to make to Jews. The story of Noah is another great example to show what? To show that only God's provision will suffice. And I'll give you an example of what I mean by that. Noah is righteous, yes? Noah is a good man. He's a righteous man. Let me tell you something, brethren. No matter how righteous Noah is, when the rain starts coming down and the water starts welling up through the oceans and everything is consumed, Noah, if he stood there and said, but I'm righteous, God will save me, Noah would have drowned if he didn't build that ark and get in. It didn't matter how righteous he was. Or in other words, Noah's provision of righteousness was not going to save him. Noah's righteousness allowed him for God to reveal the plan of what he needed to do. But God's plan was the provision that saved Noah. Build this ark, build it this size, build it with this wood, get all these, put them in there. Just do exactly what I say. It's God's providing. It's God's provision. So it's another example where man's provision could not save. Only God's provision could save. If only we had one more example, except for the fact that we do. Except for we do. How about Moses and the Passover in Exodus 34? Would there be some righteous people living in this time? Sure. What was the instruction? The innocent sacrifice had to be made. If they didn't have the innocent blood of the lamb on the doorpost, then God would take the oldest child. You could not say, but I've been righteous. I've lived righteously. I ran out of time to find the lamb and to put the blood on the doorpost, but I've lived righteously, so I'm sure that God He'll pass over my house. I don't think so. They had to put the blood of this lamb on their doorpost, or else the eldest son would die. There were no amount of previous good deeds these righteous people could have done to have any other chance of being saved. None. This is another example, a third example, in the first 2 books of the Bible, where man's provision cannot save. It has to be God's provision. What is that telling a Muslim? What is that telling anybody? Whatever you think your role is and your saving, your role is to follow the plan. But your plan is not going to save you. Only God's plan is going to get that done. Where can that lead you to next in a study? How about Isaiah 53, right? It's a great place to go. You're still in the Old Testament. And it's an unbelievable foreshadowing to Jesus. It's super obvious. Everybody, you can read that to anybody. And be like, man, I think that's probably talking about Jesus. You could probably literally read that to anybody, and I think they would get it. Why would that make sense? Because the ultimate sacrifice that's to come, right? Because at some point, these animal sacrifices has to end. They don't even get the job done properly. It takes you right to Jesus, who, by the way, they believe in. You just got to sort out that bit on the cross, which again, I don't think we got asked a question about it earlier, but if you remind me, I will speak to that. From there, what can you do? You can make the study whatever you want. You can go to the New Testament. You can look at John the Baptist and how he pointed the way to Jesus. You could do lay all that groundwork for Jesus. You could take them to Romans. I think that's a great place to go as well. The study is yours from that point. The point is, and the emphatic point to make to people, and I think to anybody, and listen, you can make this point to your children if you're trying to bring them up in the faith. The point is that over and over and over, from the beginning, only God's provision will suffice. My provision will not. Do I have a role? Noah had to be righteous. Okay, we all have a role, but ultimately it's God's provision that would save. And I think that it's a common sense way and a practical way to get from, as they say, from A to B. I appreciate your time and your attention.
We'll take just a few moments to get everything sorted for the Q and A/R, and then we'll get started in just a few moments.